At the will reading, my parents handed my sister a check for $11 million and told me to go earn my own money. I simply replied, "Understood." They thought I was just the gardener, but they did not know that every single vine root was surviving on a legal secret that belonged to me. By the time they realized their prize wine tasted like vinegar, I was already waiting at the end of the valley, ready to collect. My name is Haley Kim, and as I sat in the plush leather chair of the most expensive law firm in Raven Ridge, Oregon, I realized that the silence in a room full of greedy people is heavier than any rainstorm I have ever weathered in the vineyard. The air conditioning was humming a low, artificial note that seemed to vibrate against the polished walnut conference table. That table was a mirror, dark and glossy, and if I looked down, I could see the distorted reflection of my parents sitting across from me. They were smiling. It was the kind of tight, anticipatory smile a predator wears right before the kill, or in their case, right before the cash out. The office smelled of old paper and expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the scent of loamy soil and diesel fuel that usually clung to my skin. I had scrubbed my hands raw before coming here, digging the dirt out from under my fingernails, but I still felt like an intruder in this pristine, climate-controlled aquarium. My boots, though clean, looked rough and worn against the Persian rug. My sister, Madison, sat to my left. She was tapping a manicured finger against the screen of her phone, likely checking engagement metrics on her latest post. She smelled of vanilla and ambition. Mr. Harrison, the family attorney, cleared his throat. He was a man who had made a fortune mediating the petty squabbles of the wealthy, but even he looked uncomfortable today. He adjusted his glasses and looked strictly at the document in front of him, refusing to make eye contact with me. To my daughter, Madison Langford, he read, his voice steady but lacking its usual theatrical resonance. I bequeath the entirety of the liquid assets held by Raven Ridge Sellers, totaling $11 million. This is in recognition of her tireless efforts in establishing the brand identity and her role as the future face of our winery. The words hung in the air like smoke. $11 million. It was everything. It was the operating capital, the emergency fund, the profit from the last 5 harvests, and the insurance money from the wildfire scare 2 years ago. It was the lifeblood of the business I had physically kept alive. Madison let out a small, delighted gasp that sounded rehearsed. She reached out and took the check Mr. Harrison slid across the mahogany surface. She held it with 2 fingers, as if it were a delicate flower, and flashed a smile at our parents. And to my daughter, Haley, Mr. Harrison continued, pausing for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, I bequeath the opportunity to forge her own path. No monetary assets from the estate shall be transferred to her at this time. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I watched Madison tuck the check into her designer bag. She looked at me, her eyes dancing with a mockery she did not bother to hide. "Well," Madison said, her voice light and airy, breaking the tension with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, "I guess that settles who the favorite is, does it not? Don't look so sour. Haley, you never cared about the business side anyway. You prefer playing in the dirt." My father leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. He looked at me with the same expression he used when he found a corked bottle of wine, disappointment mixed with a desire to simply discard it. "Haley," he said, his voice dropping to that patronizing register I knew so well, "we discussed this. Madison is the face of Raven Ridge. She is the one selling the lifestyle. You chosen the fields. You chose the mud over the desk. We are simply respecting your choices." My mother chimed in, nodding in agreement, her pearls clicking softly as she moved. "Exactly. Sweetie, you always said you wanted to focus on the science. Money complicates simple things. If you want money, well, you are smart. You have that fancy degree. Go earn your own money." I looked at them, really looked at them. They were waiting for me to scream. They were waiting for the outburst, the tears, the plea for fairness. They wanted a scene because a scene would validate their decision. If I acted like a child, it would prove I was not ready to lead. If I got emotional, It would prove I was unstable. But as I sat there, 32 years old, with a doctorate in viticulture and soil science, a strange sensation washed over me. It was not anger, it was not grief, it was weightlessness. For years, I had been carrying the weight of their approval on my shoulders like a 60-pound sack of fertilizer. I had worked 18-hour days during harvest, slept in the barn to monitor fermentation temperatures, and fought frostbite at 3 a.m. to save the budding vines, all in the hopes that one day they would see me. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved that I understood the land better than anyone, they would respect me. But the verdict was in. The gavel had banged. The sentence was clear. I was nothing to them but a laborer they did not have to pay. And with that realization, the burden vanished, the hope died, and with it, the power they held over me. I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply stood up. The sound of my heavy chair scraping against the hardwood floor was a harsh, guttural shriek that tore through the quiet room. It was loud, abrasive, and violent. Mr. Harrison flinched. Madison stopped smiling. My parents stiffened, bracing for the explosion. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at my father, then my mother, and finally at Madison, who was clutching her $11 million like a shield. Understood, I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used when analyzing soil samples, objective and detached. That was it, one word. I turned to the door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the young paralegal sitting by the window. She was the one who processed the payroll, the one who saw the invoices, the one who knew that while Madison was posting photos of wine glasses on Instagram, I was the one signing off on the rootstock orders. She knew who kept the vineyard alive. For a second, our eyes met. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between me and my parents. But she quickly looked down at her lap. She knew the truth. But the truth does not sign paychecks. I walked out of the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me with a finality that felt satisfying. The Oregon sun hit me the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk. It was a blinding white heat, typical for late August. The air was dry and smelled of asphalt and pine. I walked across the parking lot to my truck, a 10-year-old pickup with a dent in the rear bumper and dust coating the dashboard. It was not a vehicle for an heiress. It was a vehicle for work. As I unlocked the door, I heard the muffled sound of laughter coming from the open window of the law firm. I heard the distinct clink of crystal glasses toasting. They were celebrating. They were drinking the vintage I had blended, toasting to an empire they thought they controlled, bought with money they thought secured their future. Let them toast, I thought as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a rough, coughing sound that I found comforting. I pulled out of the lot, leaving the town of Raven Ridge behind me. The main highway wound through the valley, flanked on both sides by rolling hills of vineyards. This was wine country, a place where the earth was worth more than gold. A mile down the road, a massive billboard loomed over the highway. It featured a 20-foot-tall image of Madison. She was wearing a flowing white dress, holding a glass of Pinot Noir, standing in the middle of a lush green row of vines. The text in bold, elegant cursive read, Madison Langford, the Queen of Soil and Wine, taste the legacy. I stared at the billboard, the Queen of Soil. It was laughable. Madison could not tell the difference between clay loam and volcanic ash if her life depended on it. She did not know that the specific row she was standing in for that photo had been struggling with a magnesium deficiency for 3 years, or that the lush green leaves were the result of a foliar spray I had applied 2 days before the shoot, so she would not look like she was standing in a graveyard. They called me a gardener. They mocked the mud on my boots. They thought the land was just scenery for their marketing campaigns. I approached the turnoff for the main estate. The iron gates of the family mansion stood open, inviting, leading up to the house on the hill where the victory party would continue. It would be easy to turn left. It would be easy to go home, pack my bags, and leave forever. But I did not turn left. Instead, I gripped the steering wheel and veered right. The tires crunched onto a gravel road that disappeared into the lower valley. Dust billowed up behind the truck, obscuring the view of the highway. This road did not lead to the mansion. It did not lead to the state-of-the-art tasting room with the glass walls and the overpriced cheese boards. This road led to the North Hollow plot. It was a piece of land my family called the ugly stepchild of the estate. It was rocky, isolated, and visually unappealing. They had ignored it for 20 years, but it was there, in the shadow of the valley, that an old, dilapidated greenhouse stood. My parents told me to go earn my own. They thought they had cut me off from the source of their wealth. They thought they had taken everything. I smiled for the first time that day as the old greenhouse came into view, its glass panes reflecting the harsh sunlight. They had no idea that while they were busy cashing checks, I had been rewriting the biological code of the entire vineyard. They kept the name, but I kept the heartbeat. And as I parked the truck in the silence of the hollow, I knew the real reading of the will had not happened in that office. It was about to happen right here, in the dirt they despised. The air inside the North Hollow greenhouse was heavy, trapped between the glass panes like a breath held for too long. It smelled of wet earth, decomposing leaves, and the sharp, metallic tang of liquid fertilizer. To anyone else, this structure was an eyesore. My parents called it the ugly debt, a remnant of a bad land deal my grandfather had made 40 years ago because he liked the drainage on the slope. They had tried to sell this parcel 3 times, but the access road was too narrow for construction equipment, so it sat here, ignored, allowing me to turn it into the only place on the estate that actually mattered. I pushed the door shut behind me, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. The silence here was different from the silence in the law office. That had been the silence of a vacuum. This was the silence of incubation. I walked over to the potting bench, a sturdy slab of rough-hewn oak stained with the rings of 1,000 beakers and pots. My fingers traced the deep gouges in the wood. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I was 12 years old again, standing on a crate so I could reach the surface. Grandfather Elias was standing next to me. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of an old vine trunk, gnarled, tough, and impossible to break. He was holding a grafting knife, its curved blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Do you know what this is, Haley?" he had asked, his voice gravelly from decades of smoking unfiltered cigarettes. "It is a knife, Grandpa," I had answered. He shook his head. "No, a knife cuts things apart. This tool decides what is allowed to live. It decides which roots are strong enough to carry the future. You do not just cut, you choose." He placed the handle in my hand. It was warm from his grip. That day, he taught me the omega graft. He showed me how to take a scion, the part that bears the fruit, and fuse it to a rootstock, the part that survives the dark, wet earth. He taught me that the fruit is just the vanity of the plant. The root is its soul. If the root dies, the fruit rots. It was a lesson my parents never learned, and clearly, one they had forgotten entirely today. I opened my eyes and looked at my hands. They were calloused, the skin rougher than Madison's would ever be. I had spent 8 years in university halls and laboratories. I had written a dissertation on microbial symbiosis in volcanic soils. I had master's degrees in viticulture and enology. I could look at a leaf and tell you the nitrogen levels in the soil 3 feet down. But when I came home, diploma in hand, ready to revolutionize Raven Ridge, my mother had looked at my boots and laughed. "Look at you," she had said, sipping her Chardonnay on the veranda. "Our little gardener with a PhD. It is cute that you like playing in the mud. Haley, but do not worry about the business. We will handle the heavy lifting. You just keep the plants pretty." The heavy lifting. I let out a short, dry laugh that echoed in the empty greenhouse. They defined heavy lifting as sitting in boardrooms and choosing font styles for the labels. They did not know what heavy lifting was. I remembered a night 3 Aprils ago. The frost alarm had screamed on my phone at 3 in the morning. The temperature had plummeted unexpectedly, dropping to 26 degrees. At that stage of bud break, 26 degrees was a death sentence for the vintage. I had run out of the house in my pajamas, throwing a coat over my shoulders, screaming for the crew, But the crew was short-staffed because my father had cut the budget to pay for a new marketing launch party. So, it was just me and 2 terrified interns. For 6 hours, we fought the cold. We ran the wind machines until the motors smelled like burning oil. We lit the smudge pots, choking on the thick, black smoke that coated our lungs. I was on my knees in the mud, physically wrapping the younger vines with burlap, my fingers so numb I could not feel the rough fabric. I ran from row to row, checking the temperatures, praying to a god I did not believe in to keep the mercury from dropping another degree. At 7 in the morning, when the sun finally broke over the ridge and the danger passed, I walked back to the main house, covered in soot and mud, shaking from exhaustion. I passed Madison's window. She was asleep. Later that day, she posted a photo of herself in bed with a cup of coffee, captioned, "Morning vibes in wine country. So peaceful." The post got 4,000 likes. My mother told me I looked like a chimney sweep and asked me to use the back door so I would not stain the carpets. They saw the wine in the bottle. They never saw the war it took to get it there. I walked further into the greenhouse, past the rows of test pots. This was where we had saved them. 7 years ago, a fungal pathogen had swept through the valley. It was aggressive. It attacked the vascular system of the vines, choking them from the inside out. Other wineries were ripping up acres of infected plants, burning millions of dollars of inventory. My father was in a panic, talking about selling the land to developers before the value tanked. But Grandfather Elias and I had locked ourselves in here. We did not sleep. We did not eat proper meals. We treated it like a war room. We tested hundreds of rootstock variations. I spent weeks culturing soil microbes, looking for a bacterial strain that could outcompete the fungus. I remembered the smell of the agar plates, the hum of the incubator, the way Elias's hands shook as he held the pipette. He was dying then, though he did not tell me. He knew this was his last stand. We found it. We found a specific sequence of resistant rootstock combined with a proprietary blend of mycorrhizal fungi. We grafted it. We planted it in the sickest part of the vineyard. And it lived. Not only did it live, it thrived. The vines grew back stronger, more drought-resistant, producing fruit with a complexity that Raven Ridge had never seen before. When we presented the solution to my parents, they were relieved, but they did not understand. My father patted me on the shoulder and said, "Good work, kiddo. Just keep at it. Work hard. And one day, this will all be yours. We are building this legacy for you and your sister." For years, that sentence was the carrot on the stick. One day, this will all be yours. I believed them. I believed that loyalty was a currency. I believed that if I poured my sweat and blood into the soil would pay me back. I thought we were a family unit, working toward a shared future. But as I stood there in the dusty light of the greenhouse, I realized the truth. It was never a partnership. It was an employment scam. To them, I was not a daughter. I was free labor. I was a high-performance machine that ran on validation instead of gasoline, and they had been siphoning the tank for a decade. They put Madison's name on the deeds and the press releases because she reflected the image they wanted to sell. I was just the mechanic in the pit, covered in grease, ensuring the car actually ran. And now, they had fired the mechanic. I moved to the back of the greenhouse, to a locked metal cabinet. I fished the key out of my pocket, a small, brass key that I never let out of my sight. Inside were stacks of notebooks. These were not diaries. They were data. I pulled them out one by one. The black one contained 5 years of soil pH logs, detailing the exact acidification schedule needed for the Pinot Noir blocks. The blue one held the nutrient cycling data, the precise ratio of nitrogen to potassium that gave our Cabernet its signature finish. The red one contained the formula for the Raven root sequence. My parents and Madison used these results every day. They bragged about the sustainable ecosystem of the vineyard in interviews. They claimed their wine was made with a secret family technique. But they had never asked to see the books. They just enjoyed the results. They assumed that the knowledge lived in the land. Or perhaps they arrogantly assumed that because I was their daughter, my mind was their property. I found a cardboard box in the corner and began to pack. I packed the log of the microclimate adjustments. I packed the breeding charts for the drought-resistant clones. I packed the detailed map of the subterranean irrigation system I had designed to minimize water waste. I packed it all. My movements were efficient, mechanical. There was no sentimentality in the way I cleared the shelves. I was scrubbing the hard drive. I was wiping the server. If they wanted to run a winery, let them run it. Let Madison figure out why the leaves turn yellow in July if you do not adjust the magnesium. Let my father figure out which cover crop prevents the nematodes from eating the roots. Let them earn their $11 million. I taped the box shut. The sound of the tape gun was loud and harsh, like a weapon being cocked. I picked up the box. It was heavy, filled with the intellectual weight of my entire adult life. As I walked toward the door, I paused and looked back at the empty potting bench. I remembered the day Elias died. He had told me, "Haley, never let them take your roots. They can sell the fruit, but you keep the roots." I had not understood what he meant legally at the time. I thought it was a metaphor. I smiled, a cold, thin expression that did not reach my eyes. If this was a business transaction from the start, then fine. I accepted the terms. They had just informed me that my services were no longer required. They had terminated the contract. The problem was that in their arrogance, they had never bothered to read the fine print at the bottom of the agreement. They forgot to check who actually owned the patent on the survival of their company. I kicked the door open and walked out into the blinding Oregon sun, carrying the brain of Raven Ridge Cellars in a cardboard box, leaving the body behind to rot. The notification lit up my phone screen with a cheerful ping that felt violently out of place in the silence of my truck cab. It was an automated alert from the Raven Ridge Company account, the kind usually reserved for harvest announcements or award nominations. The subject line read, "A New Era of Soil Science. Madison Langford Speaks." My stomach tightened, a knot of cold dread forming instantly. I tapped the screen. A high-definition video began to play. It opened with a drone shot sweeping over the Block 4 hillside, the very hillside I had terraced by hand 3 years ago to prevent erosion. Then, the camera cut to Madison. She was standing in the middle of the vines, wearing a pristine white linen shirt and designer boots that had clearly never stepped in mud deeper than a puddle. The lighting was golden hour perfect, casting a halo around her hair. I have always believed that great wine starts with a secret conversation between the earth and the root, Madison said to the camera, her voice lowered to a husky, confidential whisper. When I developed the nutritional profile for these vines, I focused on the cation exchange capacity of the clay. I wanted to unlock the microbial terroir that my grandfather and I dreamed of. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. Cation exchange capacity. Microbial terroir. Those were not just buzzwords. That was the exact phrasing I had written in my field notes 6 months ago. It was a specific hypothesis I had been testing regarding the magnesium uptake in the volcanic soil. Madison did not know what a cation was. She probably thought it was a breed of cat. Yet here she was, reciting my research, my private thoughts, my intellectual property, as if she had birthed the ideas herself. The video cut to her holding a handful of soil, letting it sift through her fingers like sand in an hourglass. It took years of my personal research to perfect this balance. She lied, smiling that winning $11 million smile. But that is the price of perfection. That is the Raven Ridge promise. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone. Instead, a different instinct kicked in. A Pavlovian response drilled into me over a decade of crisis management. I looked at the time. It was 4 p.m. Tank 7. The thought overrode the rage. We had started a wild fermentation on the premium Pinot Noir lot in Tank 7 yesterday. Wild fermentation was risky. It relied on native yeast found on the grape skins rather than commercial yeast. It was volatile and unpredictable. If the temperature inside that stainless steel tank spiked above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast would become stressed. They would stop producing fruit esters and start producing hydrogen sulfide. If that happened, $50,000 worth of wine would smell like rotten eggs by morning. I knew the cooling jacket on Tank 7 had a sticky valve. It needed to be manually adjusted during the peak fermentation spike, which, based on the sugar levels I measured yesterday, would be happening exactly right now. Madison was busy playing pretend on Instagram. My parents were likely popping champagne. No one was watching the temperature gauge. I threw the truck into gear. I did not think about the will. I did not think about the theft of my words. I just thought about the yeast. It was a living thing, and I could not let it die because of their incompetence. I drove fast, the tires kicking up dust as I navigated the back roads toward the main production facility. The winery rose up like a fortress of glass and steel against the horizon. I bypassed the grand tourist entrance with its fountains and manicured hedges and swung around to the rear service bay. This was the heart of the operation, the place where the glamorous illusion met the industrial reality. I parked in my usual spot, next to the forklifts. The hum of the glycol chillers and the pneumatic presses vibrated through the asphalt, a sound that usually calmed me. It was the sound of the harvest. I walked briskly to the employee entrance, a heavy steel security door next to the loading dock. I reached for the lanyard around my neck and pulled my keycard. I knew the sequence by heart. Swipe, wait for the green light. Hear the magnetic lock disengage. Enter. I swiped the card. Beep! A small red light flashed on the reader. I frowned. The readers were finicky sometimes. I wiped the magnetic strip on my jeans and swiped again. Slower this time. Beep! Red. The light stared back at me, an unblinking crimson eye. I stood there for a moment, confused. Through the reinforced glass window of the door, I could see the fermentation hall. I could see the rows of towering stainless steel tanks. I could see the digital readout on Tank 7 in the distance. The red numbers on the display were flickering. 86 degrees. It was climbing. The yeast was already screaming. I grabbed the handle and rattled it, but the door was solid. I was locked out. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a call from the floor manager asking why I was late. It was a text message from my father. "We are going in a new direction." The text read, "The board feels that we need a fresh start to align with Madison's vision. We do not need a gardener looking over our shoulders anymore. Your access has been revoked. Please arrange with security to collect any personal items left in the main building. Do not make a scene." I stared at the words, "Gardener." He could not even say it to my face. He had waited until I was off site, waited until the digital lock could do his dirty work for him. I opened the web browser on my phone and went to the Raven Ridge website. I clicked on the Our Story tab. Yesterday, there had been a timeline. It showed my grandfather founding the place, my parents taking over, and a section dedicated to the viticulture and science team, with my photo and a summary of my academic credentials. The page loaded. My photo was gone. The timeline had been altered. The year 2015, the year I returned from university and saved the crop from the nematode infestation, was now captioned, "Madison Langford joins the family business, shadowing Elias to learn the ancient secrets of the soil." They had not just fired me, they were erasing me. They were scrubbing my existence from the history of the land I had healed. They were taking the nights I slept in the dirt, the frostbite, the research, the science, and they were pasting Madison's face over it all. I looked up. Above the steel door, a security camera swiveled slowly, its black lens focusing directly on me. I knew who was watching. My father, sitting in his office with the air conditioning blasting, watching the monitor to see if I would break. He wanted me to pound on the glass. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to call him and scream so he could call me hysterical and justify giving the empire to the daughter who smiled pretty and asked no questions. Inside the glass, the numbers on Tank 7 flickered again. 87 degrees. I could see the pressure gauge rising. The fermentation was running away. It was boiling over. If someone did not open the glycol valve in the next 20 minutes, the batch was ruined. The complex cherry and spice notes would be cooked away, replaced by the sharp, stinging taste of vinegar and sulfur. I raised my hand to the glass. I could feel the vibration of the pumps through the door. I had the code to the manual override keypad. I could text the floor manager from my personal number. I could throw a rock through the window to get someone's attention. I could save the wine. It was my instinct to save the wine. But then I looked at the red light on the card reader again. Access revoked. If I saved it, they would claim Madison's magical soil formula worked. If I saved it, they would sell it for $80 a bottle and use the money to buy Madison another billboard. If I saved it, I was just the gardener working for free again. I lowered my hand. The camera zoomed in slightly, a mechanical whir that was barely audible over the industrial noise. I looked straight into the lens. I did not cry. I did not frown. I kept my face as blank as the slate they had tried to wipe clean. I typed a reply to my father. 2 words. Message received. I hit send. Then, I turned my back on the door. I turned my back on Tank 7. For the first time in my life, I walked away from a dying wine. I let the heat rise. I let the yeast suffocate. I let the chemical reactions spiral into chaos. As I walked back to my truck, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the pavement. I felt a strange, chilling sensation crawl up my spine. It was not fear. It was the realization of what had actually happened. They thought they had just locked an employee out of a building. They thought they had simply trimmed a branch from the family tree. They did not understand that they had just locked out the only person who knew how to keep the heart of the beast beating. They had revoked access to the one thing keeping their $11 million asset from turning into a wasteland. They had locked the doctor out of the operating room while the patient was bleeding out, and they were too arrogant to even look at the heart monitor. I got into my truck and started the engine. I did not look back at the winery. I drove toward the exit, leaving the fermentation to its fever. The destruction would not happen today, or even tomorrow. It would happen slowly, in the microscopic silence of the barrels, in the unseen chemistry of the cellar. They had deleted me from the website, but they were about to find out that you cannot delete the laws of nature, and nature was about to get very, very angry. 3 days after I walked out of the winery, my phone rang. I was sitting on an overturned crate in the North Hollow greenhouse, watching the dust motes dance in the late afternoon light. I had not spoken to anyone. I had not answered the angry texts from my mother demanding to know why I had not returned the company truck keys yet. The number on the screen was local, but it was not one I recognized. Ms. Kim? The voice on the other end was gravelly and old, sounding like it had been cured in tobacco smoke and whiskey. This is Arthur Corbett. I sat up straighter. Arthur Corbett was a name I had not heard in years. He was an ancient attorney who operated out of a small, brick building on the edge of town, far away from the glass and steel district where my parents' high-powered legal team, Mr. Harrison and his associates, did their business. Corbett had been my grandfather's friend, his drinking buddy, and, occasionally, his legal counsel for matters he wanted to keep off the corporate books. Mr. Corbett? I asked, my voice raspy from days of silence. I need you to come to my office, Haley, he said, immediately, and come alone. Do not tell your parents. Do not tell your sister. There was an urgency in his tone that made my skin prickle. But beneath the urgency, there was something else, respect. He was speaking to me not as the disgraced daughter, but as someone who mattered. I drove the truck into town, parking 2 blocks away just to be safe. Corbett's office was exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits with Elias. It smelled of cedarwood, old leather-bound books, and peppermint. There were no sleek surfaces here, no intimidation tactics, just towering shelves of case files and a heavy oak desk that looked like it had survived a war. Mr. Corbett was waiting for me. He was a small man with tufts of white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses. He did not offer me coffee or small talk. He simply gestured for me to sit. On the desk, there was a single object. It was a large, manila envelope. It was yellowed with age. The corners slightly bent. It looked like it had been sitting in a safe for a very long time. Written across the front in thick black permanent marker was one word, Haley. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that handwriting. It was jagged, forceful, and unapologetic. It was the handwriting of a man who pruned vines with a knife he sharpened himself. It was Elias. "Your grandfather gave this to me 5 years ago. Mr. Corbett said softly. He gave me very specific instructions. This envelope was to remain sealed in my personal safe. It was never to be opened upon his death." I frowned. "Then why I?" "It was to be opened only upon the fulfillment of a specific condition." Corbett interrupted gently. "The condition was that you, Haley Kim, had to leave Raven Ridge Cellars, and you had to leave of your own free will, or be forced out by the board, without having committed any crime or negligence." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "I heard about the lockout. Haley, I heard about the new direction the company is taking. The condition has been met." He slid the envelope across the desk. The paper sound was a whisper in the quiet room. I reached out, my hands trembling slightly. I broke the wax seal on the back. Inside, there was a letter on plain notebook paper and a thick stack of legal documents. I unfolded the letter first. "My dearest Haley, if you are reading this, it means they finally did it. They finally let their greed outweigh their sense. I am sorry I had to wait for this to happen, but I knew my daughter and her husband well. I knew that if I left you money, they would guilt you into signing it over to the company. If I left you shares, they would outvote you and dilute your stock until it was worthless. They are good at moving numbers around. They are not good at growing things. I could not leave you the cash, kid. I know that hurts, but money is just fruit. It rots. It gets eaten. It disappears. Instead of the fruit, I am giving you the root. Use it well. Decide what lives. Love, Grandpa." Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden. I wiped them away quickly and looked at the documents beneath the letter. The first was a property deed. It was dated 20 years ago. It detailed the transfer of a specific parcel of land, Plot 4B, locally known as North Hollow, from the main Raven Ridge estate to a private trust. The Elias and Haley Trust. I scanned the legal jargon. My eyes widened. The land where the greenhouse stood, the land where I had done all my experiments, the land my parents called the ugly debt. It did not belong to Raven Ridge. It never had. Elias had severed it from the estate 2 decades ago. "It is yours," Corbett said, his voice cutting through my shock. "The land, the greenhouse, the access road, it has been held in trust until this moment. Your parents have been paying property taxes on it because I sent the bills to their accounting department mixed in with the general estate levies. They never bothered to check the deed reference numbers. They have been paying for your property for 20 years. I almost laughed. It was exactly the kind of practical joke Elias would have loved. But there was more. Beneath the deed was a document with a gold seal from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Patent number 8992-104. Title: The Raven Root Sequence, a method for microbial soil inoculation and hybrid rootstock grafting for high-stress volcanic environments. Inventor: Elias Langford and Haley Kim. Assignee: Haley Kim. I stared at the paper. I remembered the nights we spent documenting the process. I remembered signing the forms Elias put in front of me, thinking they were just university permission slips or internal company records. "The patent is yours," Corbett explained. "Sole ownership. Your grandfather transferred his 50% share to you 5 years ago, shortly before he passed." "But," I stammered, my mind racing, "Raven Ridge uses this. The entire vineyard is grafted onto this rootstock. The yield increase, the disease resistance. It all depends on this sequence. If I own it, how are they using it?" Corbett smiled, a dry, thin smile. "Your grandfather granted Raven Ridge Cellars a revocable, royalty-free license to use the technology. It was a handshake deal, essentially, codified in a simple memorandum of understanding." He pulled a final thin sheet of paper from the file. "The terms of the license state that the right to use the Raven Root sequence is contingent upon the continued employment and technical oversight of the patent holder, you or Elias." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. When they fired you, Haley, they did not just lose an employee, they violated the terms of the license. As of 3 days ago, Raven Ridge Cellars is utilizing your intellectual property without authorization. They are infringing on your patent. I sat back in the chair, the documents heavy in my lap. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My parents and Madison were currently celebrating their ownership of the brand. They owned the shiny labels. They owned the bottling line. They owned the building and the trucks and the Instagram account with 200,000 followers. But the vines? The actual living plants that produce the grapes? Those belonged to me. Every root that drank water from the Oregon soil was doing so because I allowed it. Every dollar of profit they made from the increased yield was generated by a technology that I owned. They had kicked me out of the castle, but they had forgotten that I owned the foundation. "So," Corbett said, folding his hands on the desk, "what do you want to do?" "We can file a cease and desist order immediately. We can shut down their production. We can demand they rip out every vine grafted with your sequence." I looked down at the patent. I traced my grandfather's name next to mine. Decide what lives. If I sued them now, it would be a mess. They would fight. They would spin it. Madison would cry on camera. "No," I said slowly. "Not yet." I remembered the tank I had left boiling. I remembered the soil reports I had seen before I left. The ones showing that they were already pushing the land too hard, skipping the dormant cycles to maximize short-term profit. "They think they are masters of the universe right now," I said, my voice steadying, losing its rasp. "They think money solves everything. Let them enjoy the party." I stood up, gathering the papers that redefined my entire existence. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was the landlord. "I will wait. I told Mr. Corbett, they are going to ruin the soil. They are going to push those vines until they break because they do not understand how the rootstock works. When the first harvest fails, when the vines start to turn yellow, that is when we knock on the door." Corbett nodded, a glint of approval in his eyes. Elias would have liked that. I walked out of the office into the cool evening air. The envelope was tucked securely under my arm. I did not go back to the apartment I rented in town. I got in my truck and drove straight to North Hollow. I pulled up to the greenhouse. This time, when I looked at the dark silhouette of the structure against the stars, I did not see a sad, lonely outpost. I saw a fortress. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of earth and life wrapping around me. I switched on the overhead light. My reflection stared back at me from the glass walls. For the first time in my life, I did not see a gardener. I did not see a disappointment. I saw the CEO of the underground. My parents had the $11 million. My sister had the fame. But I held the keys to life and death in the valley. And winter was coming. I needed a weapon that was sharper than a grafting knife and louder than a cease and desist letter. I needed someone who understood that agriculture was not just about dirt. It was about intellectual property, biotechnology, and the brutal letter of the law. I found Sienna Ruiz. Sienna was a shark in a tailored blazer. She operated out of a glass-walled office in downtown Portland that overlooked the river, a stark contrast to the dusty, quiet corners of Mr. Corbett's practice. While Corbett was the shield that protected my grandfather's wishes, Sienna was the sword I needed to slice through the tangle of lies my parents had spun. She specialized in agricultural patent law and corporate compliance. She did not care about family feelings. She cared about data. We sat in her conference room, the table covered not with wine bottles, but with stacks of heavy binders and a laptop projecting spreadsheets onto the wall. We had exercised my right as the patent holder of the Raven Root sequence to audit the usage data of Raven Ridge Cellars. My parents had stalled for 3 days, claiming administrative backlogs, but when Sienna threatened a federal injunction, the files appeared in our inbox within the hour. Sienna clicked a button on her remote, and a graph appeared on the wall. The red line, representing yield per acre, shot upward at a 45-degree angle starting 3 years ago. "Haley, look at this," Sienna said, her voice cool and analytical. She pointed the laser pointer at the peak of the graph. The industry standard for high-quality Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley is about 2 to 3 tons per acre, maybe 3.5 if you're pushing it for a bulk label. I nodded. That is the limit. Anything more, and the vine gets stressed. The flavor dilutes. The plant starts to cannibalize its own reserves. Sienna tapped the screen. Raven Ridge has been pulling 5.5 tons per acre for the last 3 vintages, she said. I stared at the number. 5.5 tons. That was not farming. That was extraction. It was physically impossible to get that kind of yield from our soil without massive chemical intervention, even with my rootstock. They are vamping the vines, I whispered, feeling a wave of nausea. They are forcing the raven root sequence to overdrive the nutrient uptake. It is like putting a marathon runner on pure adrenaline and cocaine and telling them to sprint for a week straight. They will run fast, sure, but then their heart will explode. Sienna clicked to the next slide. This one was a chemical analysis of the soil composition from the main blocks, dated 2 months ago. This is where it gets interesting, Sienna said, or terrifying, depending on how you look at it. I leaned in, reading the numbers that defined the health of the land I loved. The figures were a graveyard. Organic matter was down to less than 1%. The microbial biomass, the living bacteria and fungi that I had spent years cultivating to create a self-sustaining ecosystem, was non-existent. The nitrogen levels were artificially high, spiking off the charts, indicating heavy, reckless application of synthetic urea fertilizers. They killed it, I said, my voice shaking. They killed the soil. It is just dead dirt holding the plants up. They are pumping it full of synthetics to fake the growth, relying on my rootstock's stress tolerance to keep the plants from collapsing immediately. This explains the $11 million, Sienna noted dryly. They boosted production by 40%, flooded the market with high-yield wine, slashed the operating costs by firing the soil maintenance crew, and presented the inflated profit margins to the investors as modern efficiency. I thought about Madison's video, the cation exchange capacity. She had been bragging about a balance she had actively destroyed. They were selling a story of sustainability while committing an ecological massacre. But why? I asked, looking at the devastation on the screen. They know this is not sustainable. The vines will crash. The land will take a decade to recover. Because they are not planning to farm it forever, Sienna said. She pulled up a document I had not seen before. It was a prospectus for a potential public offering or a buyout from a massive beverage conglomerate. They are dressing the pig for sale. Haley, they want to show 3 years of explosive growth, sell the company for $100 million, and walk away before the vines turn brown. My hands clenched into fists. They were going to sell the shell of Raven Ridge and leave the new owners with a toxic wasteland. But then Sienna dropped the real bomb. There is one more thing, she said. Her tone shifted. It became quieter, more dangerous. To maintain their organic certification and their state agricultural water permits while using these levels of nitrates, they needed a certified expert to sign off on the environmental impact reports. They needed a PhD in soil science to attest that the nitrogen loading was within safe limits and that the groundwater was not being contaminated. She slid a physical file folder across the table toward me. I opened it. Inside were the quarterly compliance reports filed with the Oregon Department of Agriculture for the last 2 years. At the bottom of the page, above the line marked Certified Viticulturist, Soil Scientist, was a signature. Haley Kim, Ph.D. I stopped breathing. I stared at the ink. It was blue. It was looped. The H in Haley was big and theatrical, with a flourish at the top. The I was dotted with a small, perfect circle. I had not dotted my I with a circle since I was 12 years old. My signature was spiky, illegible, a doctor's scrawl born of signing hundreds of lab manifests in a hurry. But this was the signature of a woman who prioritized aesthetics over substance. It was a signature I had seen on permission slips, on birthday cards, on checks for $11 million. It was my mother's handwriting. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold. I never signed this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know, Sienna said. I had a forensic handwriting analyst look at it this morning. It is a clumsy forgery. But, Haley, to the state of Oregon, to the EPA, and to the investors, you signed off on this. I looked up at her, the horror setting in. They did not just steal my work, they stole my name. They made you the liability shield, Sienna explained, her eyes hard. When the nitrate runoff hits the local water table, and it will, with these levels, or when the fraud is discovered during the buyout due diligence, guess who goes down? Not the marketing genius Madison, not the CEO father. You, the expert, the one who certified that this was safe. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I had thought my parents were just greedy. I thought they were selfish and dismissive. But this was not simple neglect. This was a frame-up. They knew the crash was coming. They knew the environmental fines would be massive, and they had already set up the scapegoat. If the scandal broke, they would throw their hands up and say, "We trusted our daughter, the PhD. She told us it was safe. She betrayed us." I would lose my license. I would lose my reputation. I could face criminal charges for environmental negligence and fraud. I closed the folder. The sound was loud in the quiet room. I sat there for a long moment, looking out at the gray Portland sky. The hurt I had felt at the will reading, the sharp sting of rejection, evaporated. It was replaced by something much colder, much harder. It was the feeling of a root hitting bedrock and realizing it has to crack the stone to survive. They are not just bad parents, I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. They are criminals. Yes, Sienna said, and we have them. She tapped the forgery. This is a felony, Haley, identity theft, forgery, falsifying state records. We can go to the police right now. We can blow this whole thing up. I looked at the fake signature again. I looked at the yield charts. I thought about Madison standing in the dying vineyard, lying to the camera. If we go to the police now, I said slowly, thinking like a chess player, not a daughter, they will claim it was a mistake. They will claim I gave verbal permission. They will drag it out in court for years while they scrub the servers and pay off witnesses. Sienna raised an eyebrow. So, I said, leaning forward, we do not stop them, not yet. Sienna smiled, a sharp, predatory smile. You want to let them dig the hole deeper? I want them to stand in it, I said. I picked up the forged report. We document everything, I instructed. We get the water samples from the creek next to the vineyard to prove the runoff. We get the tissue samples from the vines to prove the nitrate overloading. We build a case so watertight that when we finally pull the trigger, they will not be able to move without hitting a wall of evidence. I stood up, clutching the file. They wanted a gardener? I asked, feeling the cold anger settle into my bones. Fine, I will verify the harvest, but they are not going to like what grows. I walked out of Sienna's office not as a victim, but as a witness protecting a crime scene. They had forged my signature to hide their sins, but in doing so, they had handed me the gun, and I was going to make sure that when it went off, everyone was watching. The plan on the table was simple, brutal, and legally sound. Sienna sat across from me in her glass-walled office, the city lights of Portland flickering behind her like distant sparks. She pushed a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a draft of a motion for a preliminary injunction. We can kill it now. Haley, Sienna said, her voice devoid of hesitation. We have the patent. We have the proof of unauthorized use. We can file this tomorrow morning, by noon. Federal marshals could be at the gates of Raven Ridge, shutting down the irrigation pumps and sealing the fermentation tanks. We can demand a royalty fee of 15% on gross revenue, retroactive to the date of your grandfather's death. That would bankrupt them in a week. I looked at the paper. It was tempting. It was a button I could press to instantly stop the machinery that was grinding my legacy into dust. I imagined the look on my father's face if the marshals arrived. I imagined Madison trying to explain to her followers why the winery was wrapped in police tape. But I shook my head. No, I said. Sienna frowned, tapping her pen against the mahogany table. Why? You have them. You have the smoking gun. If I pull the trigger now, I explained, keeping my voice low and steady, I become the villain. You know how they operate. My father is a master of spin. If I shut them down while the vines still look green, the story will not be about their incompetence or their fraud. The story will be about the jealous, vindictive daughter who used a legal loophole to destroy her family's hard work, just as they were succeeding. I leaned back, crossing my arms. They will say I sabotaged the harvest. They will say the wine would have been perfect if I had not intervened. The investors will see me as a liability, not a savior. Sienna slowly lowered the pen. You want them to fail on their own. I want the failure to be undeniable, I corrected. I want the vines to collapse because of their choices, not my lawsuit. I need the physical evidence of their negligence to be so overwhelming that no amount of marketing can cover the stench. We do not stop the car. We let them drive it off the cliff, and we make sure we are standing at the bottom with a camera. We spent the next 2 weeks in a state of disciplined silence. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run back to the valley and save the plants. But I forced myself to think like a surgeon, not a nurse. A nurse comforts the patient. A surgeon cuts the patient open to remove the rot, even if it leaves a scar. We needed more ammunition. Sienna widened the scope of our audit. Since I was technically still a shareholder in the family trust that held the land title, another detail my parents had overlooked, we had the right to request internal communications regarding risk management. The emails we found were damning. I sat in my small apartment, scrolling through a thread between Madison and the new vineyard manager, a man hired solely because he was cheap and compliant. From Madison Langford. Subject, yield projections. The investors are asking for a 20% bump over last year's harvest. I do not care what the nitrogen sensors say. Just override the safety limits. The Raven root can handle it. It is practically invincible. We need the numbers for the Q3 report. From Dad. Subject, yield projections. Do what she says. We are treating the soil as a depreciating asset anyway. We just need it to hold up until the acquisition deal closes in November. After that, it is someone else's problem. I saved the emails to an encrypted drive. They treated my life's work like a disposable battery. They were not farming. They were mining. They saw the Raven root sequence not as a living system, but as an automated teller machine that dispensed cash whenever they kicked it. While they were busy extracting, I started building. I spent my days at North Hollow. If Raven Ridge was the crime scene, North Hollow was the control group. In scientific experiments, the control group is the baseline. It is the proof of what should happen under normal, healthy conditions. I cleared 2 acres of the rocky slope. I did not have millions of dollars or a crew of laborers. I had my truck, my tools, and my hands. I planted a new block of Pinot Noir, grafting them onto the Raven root stock myself, using the original, slow method my grandfather had taught me. I did not use synthetic fertilizers. I did not use industrial pesticides. I applied a compost tea I brewed myself to encourage the microbial web. I watered deeply but infrequently, forcing the roots to dig down into the fractured basalt to find their own moisture. Every day, I documented the process. I took photos of the leaves, measuring the chlorophyll density. I logged the soil moisture levels. I recorded the way the vines responded to the heat. And it was getting hot. July brought a heat wave that sat over the valley like a heavy wool blanket. Temperatures climbed to 102 degrees and stayed there. From the ridge at North Hollow, I could look across the valley with my binoculars and see Raven Ridge. It looked wrong. The vines were too green. It was a neon, artificial green, the color of a plant that is being force-fed nitrogen while it is suffocating. They were pumping water from the creek day and night, ignoring the evaporation rates. I could see the shimmering haze of heat rising off their canopy. They were pushing the vegetative growth when the vines should have been focusing on fruit development. I watched as the truck sprayed another round of fungicide, a desperate attempt to keep the stressed leaves from succumbing to mildew. They were treating the symptoms, not the disease. Sienna and I began drafting the letter. It was not a standard legal notice. It was a 50-page document that read more like an autopsy report than a lawsuit. We detailed the patent infringement. We listed the dates of the forged signatures. We attached the graphs showing the soil degradation. We included the emails where they admitted to destroying the asset. We drafted the demand: immediate cessation of all use of the Raven root sequence, destruction of all infringing plant material. This meant they would have to rip out 90% of their vineyard. Sienna looked at the draft, a terrifying smile playing on her lips. "When do we send this?" "Not yet," I said, staring at the calendar. "We send it when the grapes start to turn color. Veraison, that is the moment of truth. If the vine is weak, veraison is when it gives up. That is when the sugar accumulation stops and the acid stays high. That is when the wine turns to vinegar." I went home that night and stood in front of the full-length mirror in my hallway. I looked at myself. I was wearing my work clothes, stained with the honest dirt of North Hollow. My hair was tied back in a messy knot, but the person looking back at me was no longer the girl who had sat in the lawyer's office and said, "Understood." I practiced the words I would say when the time came. "I am not here to negotiate," I told my reflection. My voice was low, hard. "You do not have a company, you have a liability. I am not the gardener. I am the owner." I repeated the phrases until they did not sound like a rehearsal. They sounded like facts. I was stripping away the need for their approval. I was stripping away the daughter who wanted her mother to say she was proud. That daughter was gone. In her place was a creditor coming to collect a debt that could not be paid with money. Late one evening, just as the heat was finally breaking, I walked the rows of North Hollow. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The air was filled with the sound of crickets and the cooling earth. I stopped at a vine I had grafted 3 months ago. It was small, barely up to my waist, but it was strong. The cane was hardening off, turning a rich, woody brown. The leaves were a deep, dark olive color, held up toward the sky in a perfect posture of reception. I reached out and touched the main trunk. It felt cool and solid. I could feel the hum of life inside it. It was not panicked. It was not rushing. It was growing at the pace nature intended. I looked across the valley. The lights of the Raven Ridge winery were blazing. They were running a night shift, probably bottling the previous vintage to clear warehouse space for the massive harvest they were expecting. They did not know that the harvest was already dead. They did not know that the roots under that neon green canopy were rotting, suffocated by the very chemicals they thought were saving them. The collapse had already happened underground. It just had not reached the surface yet. "Let the vineyard speak," I whispered to the darkness. I did not need to scream. I did not need to fight. I just needed to wait. The land was the ultimate judge, and it was preparing a verdict that no lawyer could overturn. I turned back to my small, healthy plot. I checked the irrigation drip on the end of the row, adjusted it by a fraction of an inch, and walked back to the greenhouse. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and across the valley, my family was dancing on a grave they had dug themselves, waiting for the ground to give way. September arrived, but it did not bring the golden hue of a successful harvest. Instead, it brought the color of rust. From my vantage point at North Hollow, I watched the slow, agonizing death of the Raven Ridge canopy. It started at the edges of the leaves, a condition we call marginal necrosis. The bright, artificial green that they had pumped full of nitrogen in July gave way to a sickly yellow that crept inward toward the veins. The vines were shutting down. They had been pushed too hard, forced to run a sprint they were not built for. And now, right at the finish line, their hearts were giving out. The wind carried the scent across the valley. It did not smell like ripe fruit and promise. It smelled of dust and dry straw. The harvest reports began to leak out, whispered by the seasonal workers who moved between vineyards. The clusters were small. The berries were uneven, a phenomenon known as hens and chicks, caused by poor pollination and nutritional stress. But the real disaster was the chemistry. The sugar levels were stalling, while the acidity remained piercingly high. The physiological ripeness, the development of the tannins and the flavors, had simply stopped. The vines had gone into survival mode. They were aborting the fruit to save the root. Desperate to maintain the illusion of momentum, my parents ordered an early release of the first vintage produced entirely under the new regime. They bottled the Pinot Noir from the previous year, the last batch that still had some of my influence but had been finished by Madison's blending team. They slapped a label on it that featured embossed gold foil and Madison's signature. They called it Madison's Legacy. It retailed for $120 a bottle. I bought one from a shop in town just to taste it. I poured it into a glass in my kitchen. The color was weak, a watery garnet instead of the deep ruby it should have been. I took a sip. It was hollow. It hit the front of the palate with a burst of oak chips, a cheap trick to fake complexity, and then it vanished. There was no mid-palate, no fruit, no finish. It tasted like expensive vinegar mixed with vanilla extract. The critics agreed. 2 days after the launch, the most respected wine reviewer on the West Coast published his column. He did not hold back. He called the wine a soulless exercise in branding. Thin and astringent, and a product that has been marketed to death but starved of life. The stock price of the holding company my parents had set up took a hit. Distributors who had pre-ordered thousands of cases based on the family reputation started calling to cancel. Madison tried to fix it. She posted a video standing in the vineyard, holding a cluster of shriveled grapes. She claimed that the concentrated flavor profile was a deliberate stylistic choice, a return to European austerity. The comment section tore her apart. People who actually knew wine pointed out that shriveled grapes meant dehydration, not concentration. They asked why the leaves behind her looked burned. She deleted the video 3 hours later, but the screenshots were already circulating on industry forums. That was the moment Sienna and I chose to strike. We did not send an email. We sent a courier. The package contained the cease and desist order regarding the Ravenroot sequence. It also contained a demand for unpaid royalties totaling 15% of the gross revenue for the last 5 years. The number at the bottom of the page was staggering. It was enough to wipe out their liquid cash reserves twice over. I waited. I knew the panic that would be unfolding in the main house. I knew my father would be screaming at Mr. Harrison. I knew Madison would be looking for someone to blame. But I did not expect the car. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I was in the greenhouse, pruning the tomato plants I grew for my own kitchen. The air was peaceful, filled with the smell of basil and warm soil. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I looked out the glass wall to see my mother's silver sedan navigating the bumpy dirt road that led to my sanctuary. The car looked ridiculous here, low to the ground and gleaming, out of place among the weeds and the rocks. It stopped in front of the greenhouse. My mother stepped out. She looked smaller than I remembered. The woman who had sat at the head of the conference table, dripping in pearls and disdain, was gone. In her place was someone fraying at the edges. Her hair was pulled back, but a few strands were loose. She was wearing a trench coat, wrapped tight around her waist, as if she were cold, even though it was 70 degrees. She walked to the door of the greenhouse. She hesitated before opening it, her hand hovering over the handle. I did not go to greet her. I kept snipping the basil. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. She looked around at the rows of healthy plants, the organized tools, the quiet efficiency of the space I had built without their money. "Haley," she said. Her voice was thin. It lacked the imperious snap I was used to. I turned around, setting the shears down on the table. "Hello, Mother?" She took a step toward me, reaching out a hand, then dropping it. "We need to talk," she said. "Your father. He is not doing well. The stress, the harvest is difficult this year. The weather has been against us." "The weather has been the same for everyone," I said calmly. "My vines are fine." She flinched. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears that seemed practiced, yet fueled by genuine fear. "Haley, please, this lawsuit, this letter from your lawyer, you cannot do this to us. We are family." I said nothing. I just looked at her. "You have to understand," she continued. the words tumbling out faster now. We were never going to cut you out completely. The will, the $11 million. It was a test. I raised an eyebrow. A test. Yes, she insisted, nodding fervently. We wanted to see if you had the grit to make it on your own. We wanted to see if you could build something from nothing, just like your grandfather did. We were so proud when we saw you working out here. We were waiting for the right moment to bring you back in, to give you your share. It was a masterful performance. It was rewriting history in real time. She was trying to turn their cruelty into a lesson in tough love. She was trying to convince me that the knife they had stabbed in my back was actually a tool to help me grow. I almost admired the audacity. But then I remembered the video of Madison claiming my research. I remembered the lock on the door. I remembered the text message telling me to clear out my desk. You wanted to see if I could build something, I repeated. Yes, she said, grasping at the lifeline. And you have proven yourself. So please, drop this legal nonsense. Come home. Help us fix the harvest. Madison is overwhelmed. She needs her big sister. We can work this out. We can be a team again. I walked over to the potting bench. Underneath a stack of seed catalogs, I had placed the dossier Sienna and I had compiled. I picked it up. It was a black binder, heavy and ominous. I walked back to my mother and held it out to her. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling. Open it to page 4, I said. She opened the binder. Her eyes scanned the page. It was the soil analysis report from the state compliance filing. Look at the bottom, I said. She looked. I saw her breath hitch. She stared at the blue ink signature, Haley Kim, Ph.D. I did not sign that. Mother, I said. She looked up at me, her face draining of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I did not sign the safety certification. I continued, my voice level and cold. I did not sign the water usage permits, and I certainly did not authorize the destruction of the soil biology that I spent 10 years building. Haley, she stammered, closing the binder as if hiding the page would make the truth disappear. It was just paperwork. We needed to keep the operations running. We knew you would have signed it if you were there. No, I said, I would not have, because I know that putting 400 pounds of synthetic nitrogen per acre into volcanic clay creates a toxic runoff event. I know that you are poisoning the creek. I know that you have committed a felony. She took a step back, clutching the binder to her chest. The tears were gone now, replaced by the stark, terrified look of a trapped animal. You are going to send us to jail? She whispered. Your own parents? I watched her. I looked for a shred of the mother who used to put bandages on my scraped knees, but I could not find her. I only saw a business partner who had made a bad deal and was now trying to negotiate the exit. I am not sending you anywhere, I said. The evidence is sending you. The soil is sending you. I took the binder back from her hands. It slipped easily from her grip. I am not coming back to fix the harvest, I said. The harvest is already dead. You killed it the day you decided that marketing was more important than roots. She stood there for a long moment, the silence of the greenhouse stretching between us like a canyon. She looked at the door, then back at me, waiting for me to crack, waiting for the daughter who craved approval to surface and save her. But that daughter was not there. Please, she whispered, it will ruin us. It is already ruined, I said. I walked past her to the door of the greenhouse and held it open. The evening sun was cutting across the valley, illuminating the brown, withered slopes of Raven Ridge in the distance. You should go, I said. She walked out. She looked frail, defeated, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground. She got into her expensive car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly on the weeds. I stood in the doorway, watching her go. I held the binder in my hand. I felt a strange sense of peace. I looked down at the cease and desist order that I had printed out earlier. I had intended to give it to her, but I realized she did not need the paper to know it was over. I stepped back inside and closed the door. The latch clicked shut with a sound that felt like a final punctuation mark. I turned back to my basil plants. They were green, They were healthy. They were alive. I am not destroying my legacy. I said to the empty room, I am just refusing to cover up the rot in yours. The collapse of Raven Ridge Cellars did not happen in a quiet, dignified manner. It was a loud, chaotic avalanche that started on the specialized wine blogs and spilled rapidly into the financial news. The industry rumor mill, usually a place for gentle gossip about vintage quality, turned into a shark tank. First came the leaked emails. I never found out exactly who sent them to the Oregon Wine Business Journal, but I suspected the paralegal who had refused to look me in the eye that day in the law office. The subject lines were damning. They showed the board, my parents and Madison, discussing the deliberate overcropping of the vines. One email from my father stood out, projected on news screens across the state. We do not need the vines to survive 10 years. We just need them to look profitable for the quarterly review. Burn the soil if you have to. That phrase, burn the soil, became the headline. The investors, a group of venture capitalists from Seattle who cared nothing for romance and everything for return on investment, panicked. They triggered an emergency audit clause in their contract. They sent in a team of forensic accountants and independent agricultural compliance officers. That was when the dam broke. The auditors found the forged signatures. They found dozens of compliance reports filed with the State Environmental Protection Agency, all authorizing dangerous levels of nitrate runoff into the local creek, all signed with the loop-de-loop forgery of Haley Kim, Ph.D. The investors realized they were sitting on a toxic asset. They froze the accounts. They demanded answers. My parents, backed into a corner and watching their $11 million valuation evaporate like mist, did the only thing they knew how to do. They spun the narrative. They went on the offensive. They gave an exclusive interview to a lifestyle magazine, painting a picture of a family under siege. My mother, looking pale and tragically beautiful, told the reporter that I was a troubled, jealous sister who could not handle Madison's success. She claimed I was using a technicality in my grandfather's will, a patent I had tricked a senile old man into signing, to extort money from the family business. Then came Madison. She went live on social media. I watched it on my phone in the silence of North Hollow. She was sitting on the floor of her bedroom, wearing oversized sweatpants, her makeup carefully smudged to look like she had been crying for hours. The ring light reflected in her wet eyes. "Hey guys," she whispered to her 200,000 followers. "I do not usually do this, but I am just so heartbroken. My sister. She is trying to destroy everything we built. She is suing us for millions just because she is angry she did not get the company. She is trying to shut down the winery. She is trying to put our employees out of work." She wiped a tear. "Please, if you believe in supporting young female entrepreneurs, if you believe in family, stand with Raven Ridge. Do not let hate win." The comments flooded in. "Stay strong. Queen, your sister sounds toxic. Jealousy is a disease." It was a masterclass in manipulation. They were turning the public against me before the facts could even be filed in court. They were betting that emotion would drown out the data. My phone rang nonstop. Reporters, bloggers, even old friends from high school wanted a comment. "Is it true? Are you suing your own parents?" I did not answer a single call. I did not post a rebuttal. I did not engage in the mudslinging. I stayed at North Hollow. I had work to do. While Madison was performing for the internet, I was pressing my first vintage. The small block of Pinot Noir I had planted and tended with my own hands was ready. I worked alone in the small shed next to the greenhouse, using a hand-cranked basket press that had belonged to Elias. The juice ran out of the press, dark and viscous. It was not the watery, pale fluid that Raven Ridge was bottling. It was deep purple, almost black at the core. The smell filled the shed. Black cherry, damp earth, crushed violets. It was the smell of honest work. It was the smell of roots that had been respected. I dipped a finger into the juice and tasted it. It was perfect. The sugar and acid were in a beautiful, tense balance. It had a vibration to it, a life force that you could not fake with additives. This was my answer. This was my rebuttal. But my parents were not done. 2 days later, Sienna called me. Her voice was not the cool, collected tone of a lawyer. It was sharp with disbelief. "Haley, you need to see your email," she said. "Right now." I wiped my grape-stained hands on a rag and opened my laptop. There was a forwarded email from Sienna. The original sender was the head of R&D at a biotech lab in Santiago, Chile. The subject line was, Genetic Sequencing and Clonality Inquiry, Project Ravenroot. I frowned. I did not know anyone in Chile. I opened the email. "Dear Mr. Langford, we have received the tissue samples you sent via courier on September 12th. We are proceeding with the genetic sequencing as requested to isolate the specific microbial compatibility markers. However, we must inform you that reverse engineering a patented rootstock sequence to create a generic clone without the marker gene is a complex process that will take at least 6 months. Please confirm the wire transfer of $50,000 to expedite the process. Best regards, Dr. A. Valdez." I read it twice. The email had been sent to my father's corporate address, but in his haste, or perhaps in his arrogance, my father had hit reply all on a previous chain that included the company's general legal inbox, an inbox that the court-ordered audit had given Sienna access to just that morning. My blood ran cold. They were not just ignoring the patent, they were trying to steal it. They had cut samples of my vines, the vines I had developed, the vines Elias and I had spent years perfecting, and shipped them out of the country. They were trying to clone the Ravenroot sequence in a foreign jurisdiction to bypass my ownership. They wanted to create a knockoff version of my life's work so they could stop paying me royalties and claim the technology was theirs. It was not just theft. It was a violation of the most fundamental kind. It was like finding out someone had broken into your house and tried to photocopy your diary to sell it as their own memoir. I sat back, the silence of the shed pressing in on me. For weeks, I had been holding back. I had been playing the long game, letting them make their own mistakes. I had thought that maybe, just maybe, when the collapse happened, I would offer them a lifeline. I had thought that if they admitted the truth, if they apologized, I might let them keep the house. I might structure a payment plan for the royalties so they did not go bankrupt. I had still been holding on to the faint, childish hope that they were just misguided, that underneath the greed, they were still my family. But this was cold-blooded. This was calculated malice. They were willing to commit international intellectual property espionage rather than pay their daughter what she was owed. I stood up and walked out into the cool evening air. I looked across the valley. The lights of the main house were on. I imagined them sitting there, terrified of the audit, terrified of the failing wine, but still plotting, still scheming, still convinced they could outsmart the gardener. I thought about what Elias had told me. Cut the rot. Not the whole tree, unless the roots are rotten. I had spent my whole life trying to save the tree. I had pruned. I had fertilized. I had protected them from the frost. I had taken the insults and the erasure because I thought the family tree was worth saving. But looking at that email, I realized the truth. The roots were not just rotten, they were toxic. There was no wood left to save. If I let them survive this, if I gave them a single inch of breathing room, they would just find another way to steal from me. They would burn the soil again. They would lie to the investors again. They would drag my name through the mud until there was nothing left of me. I pulled out my phone and called Sienna. "Haley?" She answered on the first ring. "Do you have the press release ready?" I asked. "The one with the full evidence package, the soil reports, the forged signatures, the emails about burning the land, and this new email from Chile." "I have it," Sienna said. "I was waiting for your go-ahead." "Release it," I said. "Everything?" she asked. "This will destroy them. Haley, not just the company. They will face criminal charges. Your father will likely go to prison for the fraud. Madison will never sell a bottle of wine again." I looked at the stars above North Hollow. They were bright and clear, unpolluted by the haze of the city. "They tried to steal the root," I said, my voice steady and final. "So I am taking the ground back. Release it all, Sienna. Send it to the investors. Send it to the Oregon Wine Business Journal. Send it to the state prosecutor. I hung up. I did not feel happy. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt a deep, heavy sadness, like the weight of a stone settling at the bottom of a lake. It was the grief of finally accepting that the people you wanted to love were not capable of loving you back. But alongside the sadness, there was clarity. I walked back into the shed. I picked up the glass of wine I had pressed. I swirled it, watching the deep, dark liquid coat the sides of the glass. I raised it in a toast to the empty room. "To the harvest," I whispered. Then I drank it. It tasted like justice, complex, bitter, and necessary. The arbitration hearing took place in a conference room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a stark difference from the mahogany-lined office where my parents had disinherited me months ago. This room was sterile. It was designed for the clinical dissection of failed business deals. On one side of the long, laminate table sat my family and their team of high-priced corporate defense attorneys. On the other side sat Sienna, me, and a stack of evidence binders that stood 2 feet high. Behind us, the gallery was packed. The collapse of Raven Ridge had become the biggest story in the Oregon wine industry, and the press was hungry for blood. I could hear the scratching of pens on notepads, and the low murmur of speculation every time a new document was projected onto the screen. My father refused to look at me. He stared straight ahead at the arbitrator, a retired federal judge with a face like chiseled granite. Madison was wearing a black dress, modest and somber, playing the role of the grieving heiress to perfection. She held a tissue in her hand, dabbing at dry eyes whenever the proceedings paused. Sienna did not waste time with theatrics. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and began to dismantle their lives with surgical precision. She started with the patent. The respondent, Raven Ridge Cellars, has been operating under an expired license for 5 years, Sienna stated, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. They have knowingly utilized the proprietary Raven Root sequence, property of my client, Dr. Haley Kim, to artificially inflate yields. When the license holder passed away, the rights reverted to Dr. Kim. They did not seek renewal. They did not pay royalties. They simply stole the technology. Madison's lawyer, a slick man with a shiny tie, jumped up. "Objection," he said smoothly. "Ms. Langford was under the impression that the intellectual property was part of the general estate. This was a clerical error, not theft." Sienna smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile. "A clerical error?" she asked. She clicked a button on her laptop. A video file appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. It was a clip from a documentary crew that had been filming Madison for a day in the life feature 6 months ago. This was footage that had been cut from the final edit, B-roll that Sienna's investigator had recovered from the production company's digital trash bin. On screen, Madison was standing in the vineyard. She thought the cameras were off. She was holding a glass of wine and laughing with her makeup artist. "Who cares about the root longevity?" Madison said on the screen, her voice loud and brash. The video zoomed in on her face. "We just need to squeeze them for another 2 seasons to hit the valuation targets for the buyout. If the vines die, we just rip them out and plant generic clones. It is not like the soil has feelings." The room went dead silent. On the screen, Madison took a sip of wine and rolled her eyes. "Besides, Haley's little science experiment is the only reason this junk grows at all. We are using her brain for free. Might as well milk it." Sienna paused the video. The freeze frame showed Madison's face twisted in a sneer of pure greed. In the hearing room, the real Madison turned a shade of pale that I had never seen before. The tissue crumpled in her hand. The victim mask slipped, revealing the terrified child beneath. "That," Sienna said, gesturing to the screen, "is not a clerical error. That is willful infringement and intent to destroy the asset." But the real blow did not come from the video. It came from the bank. The court had ordered a forensic accounting of the Raven Ridge assets to determine the damages. The representative from the bank, a woman with gray hair and a severe suit, took the stand. She adjusted her glasses and opened a thick file. We have analyzed the transfer of assets that occurred during the execution of the Elias Langford estate. She began. I leaned forward. This was the part I had never understood. The $11 million. The bequest of $11 million to Madison Langford, the accountant stated, reading from the file, was categorized as liquid assets. However, upon review, we found that this capital was almost entirely leveraged. What does that mean? The arbitrator asked, leaning over his bench. The accountant looked up. It means, Your Honor, that the $11 million was the collateral for 3 separate high-interest commercial loans used to expand the bottling facility and pay for the marketing campaigns. By accepting the money, Ms. Langford also assumed the personal liability for the attached debt instruments. I felt a jolt of electricity run through my spine. The accountant continued, Given the current valuation of the company, which has plummeted due to the soil degradation and the recall of the vintage, the debt outweighs the assets. The $11 million does not exist. It is a negative number. Technically, by accepting the inheritance, Ms. Langford assumed a debt obligation of approximately $14 million. I stared at my parents. They were not looking at Madison. They were looking at the table. Suddenly, the pieces slammed into place. The cruelty at the will reading, the smile on my father's face when he handed Madison the check, the way they told me to go earn my own. They were not giving Madison a gift. They were giving her a grenade. They knew the company was over-leveraged. They knew the soil was failing. They needed someone to hold the bag when the creditors came calling. They had chosen Madison not because they loved her more, but because she was too vanity-obsessed to read the fine print. And me? They had disinherited me because they knew I would look at the books. They knew I would see the debt. Or perhaps, in some twisted, subconscious way, they wanted to keep the one person who actually knew how to farm away from the blast radius. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was the breaking of a chain. For months, I had carried the wound of being the outcast. I had felt less than. I had felt abandoned. But the truth was, their rejection had been my salvation. If they had given me the company, I would be the one sitting there with $14 million of debt and a ruined reputation. I looked at Madison. She was staring at the accountant, her mouth slightly open, horror dawning in her eyes. She realized it too. She was not the favorite. She was the scapegoat. The rest of the hearing was a blur of technicalities. Sienna presented the forged signatures. My mother tried to claim I had given verbal consent, but the sheer volume of documents, hundreds of falsified state filings, made her defense sound pathetic. The handwriting expert confirmed the forgeries with 100% certainty. The arbitrator did not need long to deliberate. He returned after a recess of only 1 hour. He sat down and looked at the Langford family with open disdain. I find that Raven Ridge Cellars has engaged in gross negligence, willful patent infringement, and fraud, he announced. His voice boomed in the quiet room. I am issuing an immediate, permanent injunction against the use of the Raven Root sequence. Raven Ridge must destroy all infringing plant material within 30 days. Furthermore, I am awarding the plaintiff, Dr. Haley Kim, past royalties and punitive damages in the amount of $8 million. He turned to the bank representative. Regarding the liability for the environmental damage and the investor fraud, I am referring this matter to the state prosecutor's office for criminal investigation. The gavel hit the wood. Bang. It was over. The room erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions. The investors' lawyers were already on their phones, initiating the liquidation protocols. I stood up. My legs felt steady. My hands were not shaking. I watched my parents. My father was slumped in his chair, looking suddenly 20 years older. My mother was weeping, clutching my father's arm. Madison was sitting frozen, staring at nothing. The $11 million check she had bragged about, now a prison sentence around her neck. Sienna turned to me and smiled. We did it. Haley. Yes, I said. We did. I gathered my files. I did not look at the table where my family sat. I did not want to see their faces. I did not want to hear their apologies or their accusations. They were no longer my problem. They were just people who used to own a winery. I turned toward the exit. "Ms. Kim! Ms. Kim!" a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone in my face as I reached the aisle. "How do you feel about bankrupting your own family? Do you have any comment for your sister?" I stopped. The camera flash blinded me for a second. I looked at the reporter. "I did not bankrupt them," I said, my voice calm and clear. "The truth did." And with that, I pushed past the cameras and walked out the double doors. I walked into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights hummed with a different frequency. It was the sound of freedom. I was not Haley the gardener. I was not Haley the disappointed daughter. I was Dr. Haley Kim, the owner of the Raven Root patent, the scientist who had refused to let the lie take root. I walked toward the elevators, leaving the chaos behind me. I did not look back. I knew that if I turned around, I would see them emerging from the room, looking for me, looking for a bailout, looking for forgiveness. But I had nothing left to give them. I had given them my labor. I had given them my childhood. I had almost given them my name. Now, all I had left was my own life. And as the elevator doors slid open, waiting to take me down to the street level where the sun was shining, I decided that was finally enough. The weeks following the verdict were a blur of bureaucratic dismantling. Raven Ridge Cellars did not end with a bang, but with the squeal of packing tape and the rumble of moving trucks, the judgment debt was insurmountable. Between the $8 million owed to me and the penalties levied by the state for environmental negligence, the company was insolvent. They could not pay. The bankruptcy court ordered a liquidation of assets. I stood on the ridge of North Hollow and watched as the auction signs went up. The main house, that sprawling mansion where my mother had hosted her galas and where my father had plotted his empire, was listed for sale. The fermentation tanks, the bottling line, and the fleet of branded trucks were sold off piece by piece to cover the creditors. But the land, the scorched, chemical-laden earth of the main vineyard, nobody wanted it. It was a liability. The remediation costs alone were estimated to be in the millions. That was when I made my move. I did not buy it myself. I did not have the capital. And frankly, I did not want the debt attached to the deed. Instead, I made a phone call to the Cascadia Sustainable Agriculture Fund. They were a group of serious, long-term investors I had been consulting with quietly for 2 years, advising them on soil regeneration projects up and down the coast. I presented them with a plan. I told them the land was distressed but not dead. I told them that with the Raven Root sequence, which I owned, and a 5-year rehabilitation plan, we could bring the valley back to life. They bought the assets for pennies on the dollar, and in the fine print of the acquisition deal, there was a clause that my parents likely never saw, though it would not have mattered if they did. The clause appointed Dr. Haley Kim as the director of viticulture with absolute operational control. I was not the owner of the debt. I was the master of the soil. The day the transition became official, I drove my truck up the main driveway. I slowed down as I passed the spot where the billboard used to stand. The massive image of Madison, the queen of soil, was gone. Workers were dismantling the steel frame, cutting it apart with torches. Sparks showered down onto the dry grass. I drove into town later that afternoon to sign the final papers. I passed a small, nondescript apartment complex near the highway. Parked out front was my mother's silver sedan, looking dusty and scratched. My father was standing on the balcony, smoking a cigarette, staring blankly at the traffic. They had lost the mansion. They had lost the status. They were just 2 people living in a 2-bedroom unit, trying to figure out how to pay the rent on a pension that was much smaller than they had anticipated. I did not honk. I did not feel a surge of glee. I just felt a quiet sense of correction. The universe had balanced the books. When I arrived at the winery gates, the sun was high and bright. I pulled my truck up to the employee entrance, the same steel door where the red light had once mocked me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a key card. It was new. It simply said Director. I held it up to the reader. Beep. The light turned green. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a solid, satisfying thud. I walked inside. The air in the fermentation hall was still, but it was no longer heavy with panic. The new management team was waiting for me. These were not marketing executives in shiny suits. They were agronomists, hydrologists, and systems engineers. They were people who looked at a vine and saw a biological system, not a dollar sign. Dr. Kim, the site manager said, stepping forward and extending a hand. We are ready to start the soil flushing program whenever you give the order. We have reviewed your protocols for the cover crops. It is brilliant work. He did not ask who my father was. He did not ask about the scandal. He respected the science. For the first time in that building, I was not the daughter of the boss. I was the boss of the land. We walked through the facility, planning the demolition of the old chemical storage units. We talked about planting legumes to fix the nitrogen naturally. We talked about patience. As I walked back out to the parking lot, the sun was beginning to set. The workers were finishing the removal of the main sign. The giant letters RAVENRIDGE were lying on the grass, disjointed and meaningless. In their place, a new, modest sign was being hoisted up. It was made of reclaimed wood, simple and unpretentious. The Elias Project, Regenerative Viticulture and Research. It was not a brand. It was a mission statement. I stood there, watching the name of my grandfather rise against the sky. When I heard footsteps behind me, I turned around. Madison was standing there. She looked different. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, clothes that looked like they had been bought off the rack. Her face was bare of makeup. She looked younger, smaller, and incredibly tired. There was no camera crew behind her. There was no phone in her hand recording a vlog. "Hello, Haley," she said. Her voice was quiet. "Hello, Madison," I replied. She looked up at the new sign, then down at the letters lying in the grass. "It is a nice name," she said. "Grandpa would have liked it." I nodded. Yes, he would have. She scuffed her sneaker against the pavement. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of the wind in the fir trees. "I am sorry," she said suddenly. She looked at me, and for the first time in her life, her eyes were clear. "I am sorry about the video. I am sorry about the lawsuit. Mom and Dad, they told me it was the only way. They said you were the enemy. I went along with it because it was easier than asking questions." I listened to her. I waited for the anger to flare up. I waited for the need to scream at her, to list every insult, every stolen idea, every moment she had taken credit for my work. But the anger did not come. It was gone, washed away by the work I had done at North Hollow. "Do you hate us?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Do you think you will ever want to forgive us?" I looked at her. I looked at the sister who had been a pawn in a game she did not understand until checkmate. "I do not hate you, Madison," I said gently. "Hate takes too much energy. I need that energy for the vines." I took a step closer, not to hug her, but to look her in the eye. As for forgiveness, I do not think that is the right word. Forgiveness implies that I want to repair the relationship. It implies that we can go back to how things were. I shook my head. "We cannot go back. You stole from me. You tried to destroy my reputation. Those are not things you just fix with a conversation in a parking lot." I watched a tear slide down her cheek, unheeded. "I am not going to punish you anymore," I said. "The world has done enough of that. But I am not going to invite you in, either. I have a lot of work to do to fix this soil, and I cannot have anyone here who does not know the difference between a root and a weed." Madison nodded slowly. She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I understand," she whispered. She turned to go. She walked to her car, a small, older model that must have been a downgrade from her luxury SUV. She opened the door, then paused. "Good luck with the harvest. Haley," she said. "You too," I replied. "Good luck with your life." I watched her drive away. I felt a lightness in my chest that I had not felt in years. I had not given her the absolution she wanted. But I had not given her the cruelty she feared. I had just given her the truth. I turned back to the gate. I locked it behind me, securing the facility for the night. I drove back to North Hollow as the stars came out. The air was cool and crisp. I parked the truck and walked into the vineyard, the place that had never lied to me. I walked down the rows of young Pinot Noir vines. They were asleep now, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. They were rooted deep in the earth, drinking from the water table that I had protected. I stopped at the end of the row. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old grafting knife Elias had given me. The handle was worn smooth by 2 generations of hands. I found a small shoot growing near the base of a vine, a sucker that was sapping energy from the main trunk. It was growing in the wrong direction, twisting away from the trellis. I took the knife. With a clean, decisive motion, I sliced it off. The wound on the vine was small and green. It would heal. The plant would be stronger for it. I held the severed shoot in my hand for a moment, then dropped it to the ground to decompose and feed the soil. Not every root can be saved, I whispered to the silence of the valley, but the ones that are still whole are worth protecting. I put the knife back in my pocket and walked toward the greenhouse, leaving the darkness behind me, ready for the morning sun. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It was a long journey from that cold lawyer's office to this quiet vineyard, and I am grateful you stayed with me until the end. I would love to know where you are listening from today. So please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on whether you think I made the right choice with my family. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so more people can hear about the power of knowing your own worth. Until next time, keep your roots deep.